Hello, and welcome to the Sana Psychological Podcast, your safe space for connection, healing, and growth. Each episode, our experienced clinicians and special guests will share strategies, stories, and resources to support your unique path to well-being. Because at Sana, your mental health matters. Thank you for joining us today on this episode of the Sana Psychological Podcast. Last time I was joined by Sabrina Markandu to talk about trauma, what it is, and how to distinguish it from upsetting experiences. Today I have Sabrina back to talk more about trauma treatment. I'm Paige Abbott. Sabrina Markandu, my guest today, is a registered psychologist who works with teens and adults around a variety of mental health concerns, including trauma. She's interested in trauma's impact on how individuals understand themselves and relate to the world around them. In her practice, Sabrina uses a number of trauma-informed practices, including EMDR, internal family systems therapy, and client-centered approaches to support individuals and their loved ones. Welcome back, Sabrina. Thank you for joining me again to continue discussing the topic of trauma.
Hey, Paige. Yes, thanks for having me back.
Of course. Always great when someone's willing to come back a second time after the first episode that they taped. So I'm thrilled to have you here. And last time we were really delving into your topic of specialty, which is more so the identification and experience of trauma. And today, what we're going to be talking more about is the treatment of trauma, and more so
Mhm.
in the therapeutic context. But last episode, you had also made mention to different self-care strategies that people can use to help them cope and process trauma. And we might talk about that a little bit as well. But we're going to discuss your experience as a trauma therapist and what that has looked like in practice. So, really excited to get talking about that with you today.
Me too.
So, I guess the first question that often comes up for people when they're thinking and identifying that they might have something like a trauma that they would like to start exploring, the big question is, how will people know when it might be time to start seeking support for trauma?
Yes, I think that's a great question. Kind of like what we talked about last time, is that it might look different for every person. So I do want to almost like caveat what I'm about to say by saying like
That's
these
fair.
are just like some of the trends I've noticed. But it might again look different for every person at different times in their life. I find kind of like what we talked about last time that responses to trauma are usually adaptations. So we are trying to find ways, our nervous system is trying to find ways to cope with what is going on and to understand maybe why it happened. And so human beings were incredible adapters. Many people will find, okay, I'm going to go back, use some of my old coping strategies. I'm going to use some new ones as well. Sometimes for people, it might be like, okay, maybe when I was younger, I used to journal a lot. So let me try
Mhm.
journaling and see if that helps me feel better. Okay, that maybe didn't work. Let me try, running. I'm going to try that for the first time. Everybody seems to run. Let me see if that works. And I find that people might want to come to therapy specifically to support their healing. I find that people show up when it feels like they've tried all different coping strategies that maybe previously have worked for them, but for whatever reason, it's not working right now.
Mm.
And I find that usually people come in and they feel a little bit stuck, where it's like, again, how come I went through this? Is there something wrong with me? I tried all these coping strategies. I looked online, I talked with other people, even. They all gave me these suggestions, but something is still not clicking for me. Am I missing something? And I think that kind of curiosity draws a lot of people to counseling, which again can also be like a very courageous thing to do to accept that, okay, something isn't fitting right now in my life. I might need a little bit of extra support with it. That's why I really like working with people as we're helping them sort of like heal through trauma, because I think a lot of it is tapping back into that intuition. Okay, maybe, working out, doing yoga, that seemed to have helped you go through stressors in the past and cope in the past. Maybe we need to adapt something with
Mm.
it. Maybe instead of, going on a run alone, maybe joining a run club feels a little bit better in this sort of season of your
Nice.
life. And so, yeah, that's kind of what I like to look at.
I love that. And I was thinking this could apply to other areas of mental health as well, because I think that's often what we see as therapists, no matter our area of specialty, is people coming in when, like you said, they've tried their adaptive self care coping strategies that have worked in the past and have been
Mhm.
enough to support them. And maybe now they're noticing, it's just not quite getting me to the place that I'd like to be. Or, as you were using that really beautiful word of intuition, I'm almost intuitively sensing that something's missing or there's a gap there.
Mhm.
And that is an often common place where people will start to have that wondering of, okay, well, what else is out there? And sometimes people have tried therapy before and they're comfortable to return and adapt it to this set of circumstances and experiences, and others have not tried therapy before. So this might be a new experience for them. And
Mhm.
whether people are new to therapy in general, or maybe they're just new to trauma therapy, I'm interested, Sabrina, your thoughts on what are some common fears or misconceptions that people often have about trauma therapy before they come into it?
Yeah, I have noticed that I think especially with trauma, a big fear that a lot of clients have is, am I going to have to remember all the details about what I've been through? And am I going to have to share every single detail as
Mm,
well and almost like relive that trauma in order to understand it or process it? And I usually tell people, even in my kind of informed consent at the beginning of therapy, is that you do not have to know or tell me about all the details about something that you've been through in order for you to heal or in order for me to understand you.
mm,
I think sometimes context certainly is important when we talk about why, an emotion has come up or why a certain thought has been sort of like, I don't know, understood or come up in our mind. Context is important, and sometimes it helps to share with somebody else, like, hey, I know that I can share something horrible I've been through with my psychologist because, that's her job. That's her job to hear me out, to regulate, and be with me in all of the muckiness of it. And so I do kind of hold a balance of, yes, share with me whatever details you feel are most important or relevant for me to know. But that also, we don't have to go through every single detail or comb through what happened. We can often experience a lot of healing and a lot of, I guess, understanding about what we went through or even acceptance of I might never know why this happened to me. And sort of like, I don't know, I'm making a hand motion right now of like, working with Play-Doh, being really
mm,
pliable,
mhm.
stretching, coming back together, stretching again and coming back together. Yeah, that's sort of, I think, the biggest misconception about trauma therapy is that everything's going to be relived again, and it doesn't have to be.
I can see that, and I can see how that would definitely be not just a misconception, but a big fear for people because
Mhm.
here you are putting in all of this work inside, both consciously and unconsciously, to protect yourself from that experience. And so
Mhm.
to think about stripping that all away in a sense to heal can feel obviously very scary, but obviously maybe a little bit counterintuitive as well. That it seems like,
Mhm.
is that really going to help me or is that going to hurt me? And I can see how that sharing would be an evolving process process as the
Hmm.
therapy unfolds. That maybe initially what people feel comfortable to share or remember to share will be what it will
Hmm.
be. And as the experience goes on, maybe that expands, maybe it doesn't, or maybe it shifts in a different direction. So that's also the
Hmm.
neat thing about therapy as a process, is just seeing where people can go as they feel comfortable and as they start to build that foundation for healing within
Hmm.
themselves. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
talking about therapy as a process, obviously, processes take time. And I think in our culture today, we don't like things to take a lot of time. And I've also sensed there can be this impatience, specifically around trauma healing and trauma counseling. So I'm sure all of the questions we're talking about today will need to have that caveat you mentioned before on them, that everybody's
Hmm.
different, every case is different. But in general, if someone was coming up to you and saying, well, how long does it take to heal from trauma? What do you think you would say to them?
Yeah. I usually like share a chuckle with people when that question is brought up because I have found
Yeah.
whenever someone asks that, there is again this feeling of like, oh, I know, I think I know what she's gonna say, which is that it looks different for every single person, which is unfortunately that's kind of like the sort of underlying, I guess, sort of thought with healing is that and timelines is that yeah, it looks different for every person. And I could also relate a lot to the sense of like urgency of, okay, I just, labeled or identified what happened to me as traumatic. And now I just want to get through it. I want to get to the other side of this. I don't want it to
Yeah.
impact me anymore. So I definitely like relate to that. Yeah, that sensation quite a bit. I do think that I sort of look at especially trauma healing, maybe in like different phases. I think the research shows that there's lots of different models for healing from trauma. One of the ones that I like best sort of looks at trauma in like a triphasic model. So there's three different phases. The first phase comes back to what we spoke about, Paige, in our first episode, where we look at that window of tolerance. So can we build safety and stabilization as soon as possible? And so we don't need to be perfect. I don't need to, never be triggered by something, but can I start gathering some self-care strategies, some coping strategies that can increase my optimal zone so that I feel more stable and I have a little bit more capacity to maybe relook at some of the harder emotions, some of the more overwhelming or intense emotions that I've been through, or even thoughts or body sensations that I've experienced. So, yeah, that's kind of that first phase. That second phase is sort of that processing um, kind of work. And so, again, looking at, okay, what messages did you receive from society or your family about what you've been through and about what that means about you? And do you want to keep some of those thoughts? Do you want to get rid of them? Or do you want to adapt them as well? And then finally, that third phase is sort of this kind of idea of like remembrance. And so, what is tough, I think, about trauma is that we can't erase it from our memory. We can't just forget that it happened. But I usually tell people, how can we almost like turn the volume down
Mm.
on these experiences so that, when I reflect back on my life or when I think about, someone asked me the question, hey, who are you? What does it mean to be you? I don't go right to that trauma, but I talk about, things that I want to talk about, things that do feel more, um, I think like things that we feel almost more proud of. Sometimes that could be, yeah, I've been through a lot of shit in my life and I am resilient. Maybe that's something that we focus on more. So that sort of like triphasic model is something I keep in the back of my mind. But again, healing isn't linear. We don't go from, phase one to phase two, phase three. There's often a lot of jumping around from, phase
Hmm.
one to a bit of three to a bit of two to one. And that's part of that, stretching and coming back together. Where I'll also say in therapy, it's not up, doesn't have to be just up to the client to decide where we go. Part of that is my job to check in. And again, kind of goes back to this idea of you're not alone in this healing process. I can also help and again, give some different perspectives And you can decide, yeah, what fits best for me.
Mhm. And it sounds like this journey is also not going to happen in just an hour or two. So, not one or
Yes.
two therapy sessions. And that's the part where, if you are exploring trauma therapy, that'll be an open and active dialogue, I anticipate, with your
Mhm.
therapist to talk about just the general process that maybe the therapist is envisioning based on what you had shared and what some of your goals are, and then also balancing that with your available resources, right? So I
Mhm.
know a lot of people come in, well, tell me, will I be, fixed or healed in what will it be? 5 sessions, 10 sessions, 12 sessions? And obviously, no one has a crystal ball, including the therapists themselves, to determine that, but at least getting some general idea of where you want to go in what time frame, and is that reasonable, is a
Mhm.
discussion between the client and the therapist.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think too that like, yeah, healing, doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so, yeah, people might be coming into therapy to talk about a specific incident or something that they've been through, but they're also typically continuing to live the rest of their lives and things can
Yeah,
come up,
so true.
even just day to day. And so, yeah, how can we build more of that tolerance even for flexibility? That's part of the therapeutic work as well.
Nice. Can you give us some insight into the general trauma treatment process? Obviously, there's different modalities out there that
Mhm.
different therapists will use. And so that will kind of shift the structure and what exactly is happening in a session. But just talking about more so like what the experience will feel like and look like for people if they are on that brink of considering some trauma therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I like to use oftentimes, like you said, Paige, there are many different like modalities of therapy, especially in trauma therapy. So for example, I'm trained in EMDR that offers a little bit more sometimes structure to sessions. But other people might want to be a little bit more, like let's see just like what comes up. That's also a big kind of focus that I also use in therapy that kind of going back to what we were talking about with that intuition of if you come to session and there's something that's sort of, scratching at that intuition in your gut, let's go with that. Let's see what comes up if we talk about that intuitive kind of piece. And so, again, I sort of look at first, let's try to build some of the sort of toolbox that we can use if we start talking about something and it gets a little bit overwhelming. Maybe it feels like we're being triggered again. And so, what coping strategies do we have? What kind of supports do we have outside of therapy? And if we don't have any of those, let's start by building some of it. So, in session with me, I like to kind of balance a bit of the sort of focus on, again, that nervous system. Maybe before we start a session and get into things, why don't we do some regulating, maybe some deep breathing right now? And then let's talk about, okay, what's coming up for you? What do you feel like your intuition is saying we have to kind of go towards? Talk about that a little bit. Maybe we do an EMDR session one day where we might do some more active kind of like processing of a specific memory or specific thought that we might have. And then, yeah, maybe we end the session, by kind of like shaking it out or drawing a picture to kind of like reflect in many different, sort of like ways that human beings, again, make meaning about something. For some of us, it's talking. For some of us, it might be dancing or moving our body. Other people, it might be, writing or drawing something. And so I try to be, again, pretty like focused on, yeah, what does the client want? What feels most meaningful for them? And let's go with that. There's something about that that I think is like interesting.
I love that. And it also gives people permission to meet themselves where they're at. That
Yeah.
maybe one day it is, they want to just get up and move. They feel this need to like move their body, shaking or jumping jacks or just some sort
Mhm.
of more vigorous movement. And maybe some days it's lay down on the floor or do some gentle stretching, or maybe it does open up this creative, I just want to draw or I just want to scribble on a piece piece of paper. Or I think last time you were talking about Play-Doh. I just want
Hmm.
to like do something with my hands, and it can take so many different directions. And I think that's a really cool part actually of trauma healing, is tuning back into what are those preferences, what are those intuitive directions that we're feeling called to go.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. It's all about that getting, I guess, like gaining back that power and control that we have over our lives. Again, trauma takes away our ability to control or have power over our lives. And so I think therapy can be, I think it's really important that I guess therapeutic spaces are empowering, that again, they emphasize that choice of, okay, yeah, where do you want to go today?
Yeah.
And that means even just knowing that, that means it's important to you.
I love that. My last question I'm going to ask you today: what are your top two or three tips that you would give to people who are interested in looking for trauma therapy? How do people go about determining a good fit therapist for themselves?
Mm,
Any kind of
mhm.
top tips you would give to people who are curious about that, but now looking at all the options and, to be fair, probably feeling pretty overwhelmed? How would you
Yeah.
encourage them to go about that process?
Yeah, for sure. I think so. It is maybe a little bit counterintuitive, but I guess going through or experiencing trauma, again, our world can sometimes feel a lot smaller. And so I think one of the best ways, I guess, to determine, hey, what will work best for me is by tapping into our natural curiosity, seeing what sort of naturally pulls us towards something. And so, lots of times psychs will have their bios online. It can be a lot of, jargon and psychological terms that might start to feel a little bit almost like just a bunch of buzzwords all sort of blending together. But if there's a word that sticks out to you, maybe it is emotions, maybe it's people pleasing, maybe it's, the body. If that feels like, hey, actually, I find, I'm a pretty emotional person right now, not sure what's going on with that. Here's a psychologist that's talking about exploring emotions. Maybe that's the place I want to go. Um, so kind of using that intuition. And then I often recommend like booking those, free consultation meetings with psychologists and asking some of those questions about, hey, what does therapy look like with you? What am I
Mhm.
expected to bring into session versus do you usually lead sessions? I think, yeah, asking those kinds of questions, again, kind of being curious and then sitting with it for a moment and seeing, okay, does that fit with what I think I need for healing? Yeah, kind of integrating it in that way at like a very surface level, right? If that makes sense.
Mhm, mhm. No, I think those are great tips. And I know for myself, also getting a moment to glimpse somebody's energy can feel pretty
Mhm,
important for me. And I think that's the value of reading those bios, watching any videos they might have posted, doing that consultation initially. Again, just gives you a sense of that vibe and how you feel in that person's presence, because therapy, it is a relationship, and it needs to
mhm,
be a relationship that feels not only safe, but I don't know, something else there that draws you to it, right? Like
mhm,
you want to show up and spend some time with that person. You don't want to feel like you're dragging your feet into the therapy space or the therapy session in order to participate, because that might have an impact on your therapeutic outcomes. And it's also okay.
mhm,
I know for myself, I'm a pretty practical person. So I often also will narrow down some of the options based on logistics. That if I know
mhm,
there's certain places I don't want to travel, for instance, or considering, do I want virtual or do I want in person? Those can be some good factors to consider as well. And then sort of exploring the people who are available within any of those parameters you might have for yourself. So I appreciate your
Mhm.
tips, and I'm sure the listeners do as well as they're sitting here, maybe thinking about some trauma treatment for themselves, or maybe some people have already done trauma treatment, and this is a continuation or maybe a re exploration of some things that have come up. And that's okay too. Just because we've done trauma treatment before doesn't mean that something may not show up at a later point in time that might
Mhm.
bring you back into that therapy space to look at again, right?
Yep, absolutely. I always say that like therapy, I view it as like it comes in seasons, right? There might be one season
Mm-hmm.
that comes up where, okay, this is the impact I'm feeling right now. Let me go see if I could talk that out, build my self-awareness and self-knowledge. And then, okay, now I'm going to put it to the test, maybe take a break from therapy and maybe come back at a different time in my life, either to that same therapist or maybe to someone else. Maybe I have more self knowledge that, okay, maybe the type of therapy I need looks a little bit different in this season of my life. Yeah, that openness to change. Again, I struggle with it sometimes. And again, that's that counterintuitive piece of I could also be helpful
Yeah.
in deciding, yeah, what type of kind of treatment or trauma help might work best for me.
Beautiful. And a note to everyone out there that on our SANA psychological website, we have a section of free resources, and we do have a section specifically on trauma. So we have some recommended books and apps on there, as well as some resources that our team has created to support you in your journey, whether just starting to look at this or further along in your trauma exploration and healing. So we would very much invite you to come check that out to continue this work for yourself. And I really want to thank you, Sabrina, for your insight and your wisdom. And I just love your calm, relaxed demeanor. And I like how you can also bring a bit of humor into this space because it can feel like a very serious and heavy space
Mhm.
to be in. And I think it's important to feel sometimes that sense of levity and lightness. And I can totally hear how you would bring that into the therapeutic space in, of course, a very gentle and respectful way. But there's a good place
Mhm.
for humor and smiling and laughter when we're sifting through some of the hardest parts of our lives.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for
Yeah.
having me, Paige,
Thank you so much. I hope you'll join us again.
for sure.
Thank you for listening to the Sana Psychological Podcast. We're glad you joined us today. For more resources, free tools, or to book a session with our team, visit sanapsychological.com. Your mental health is our priority. Until next time, be gentle with yourself and take good care.